Caroline Levitt built her political brand on a perfect marriage, but in just one hearing, Jasmine Crockett exposed major contradictions, tore that story apart. The result? Her credibility collapsed on live camera, and even her closest allies turned away in silence. What if Caroline's perfect marriage was never real, but just part of a carefully staged political performance? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The title of the hearing was the kind that lulled you into underestimation: Media Integrity and Truthfulness in the Digital Age. Dry, procedural, harmless. At least that's what the aides whispered as they passed out the printed agendas. White paper, black ink, lifeless. But the energy in the room said otherwise. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it pressed down like a storm about to break. Phones were already held at the perfect angle. Reporters didn't blink. And then she walked in, Caroline Levitt. Every inch of her was polished to perfection. Cream-colored blazer, not a wrinkle in sight, pearl earrings that caught just enough light, and that media-trained smile that had become her signature. This was not a woman who entered rooms, she occupied them. She moved like the narrative was already written in her favor. Caroline took her seat at the head table like she had done it 100 times before. In a way, she had. Ever since her days as a Trump spokesperson, she'd crafted herself into a symbol of traditional American values. Her marriage, her faith, her flawless rhetoric. To the cameras, she was the golden standard. The kind of woman cable hosts praised, the kind of story donors loved. Her husband, a financial executive turned nonprofit consultant, was a cornerstone in that narrative. They were framed as the couple that prayed together, stayed together, and stood tall as the moral contrast to liberal decay. And yet, across the aisle sat a woman who didn't belong to the same playbook. Jasmine Crockett, Democratic representative from Texas, wasn't smiling. She wasn't fidgeting. She was simply waiting. And somehow that silence felt louder than any monologue. Jasmine didn't dress to impress. A plain navy suit, no makeup tricks, just focus. She sat still, calm, watching. No tapping, no shifting, just waiting. People didn't talk about her, but they noticed her. She wasn't the center of attention, but somehow eyes kept drifting her way. Something about her felt steady, unbothered, like she knew exactly what was coming and wasn't afraid of it. The gavel hit. The noise stopped. The hearing began, but the air felt thick, like the space between lightning and thunder. Caroline smiled too wide. The chairman spoke, but no one really heard him. Everyone was watching Jasmine, still, silent, ready, and somehow you just knew. Something was about to crack. The silence didn't last. It never does. Not when truth is sitting just inches from the mic, wrapped in red cardstock and quiet intent. Jasmine didn't pause for effect. She didn't raise her voice. All she did was reach forward and place a red folder flat on the table in front of her. No label, no seal, just a solid, deliberate thump. Soft, but final. It wasn't what she said. It was how still she was when she said nothing. The sound echoed louder than expected, like it didn't belong in a room so carefully scripted. Caroline's gaze flicked downward for a split second. She adjusted the pen in her hand, then stilled it. Across the aisle, aides shifted in their chairs, but not out of discomfort, out of anticipation. The press corps, silent until now, raised their phones just a few degrees higher. Something was coming and everyone knew it. Jasmine hadn't even opened the folder yet, but the power of it was already leaking into the room. Her tone when it came was calm and crisp. In the past 12 months, she said, Representative Levitt has spoken often and publicly about her marriage. Her fingers rested lightly on the red folder, as if it weighed nothing. Her words, on the other hand, were heavier by the second. On television appearances, podcasts, interviews, and political events, she's presented her relationship as a pillar of personal character, as a symbol of consistency, as proof of principle. She didn't accuse. She didn't challenge. She explained, clearly, methodically. But when the stories shift depending on the audience, the message stops being a value and starts becoming a tactic. She opened the folder. Page 1, printed transcript, standard formatting. February 14th, Jasmine said, interview on a Tampa-based political podcast. Her quote, verbatim, "We've never spent a Valentine's Day apart in 8 years." Jasmine paused just enough to let the words sink in, but not long enough for Caroline to interrupt. Yet on that same week, Representative Levitt posted from a policy summit in Nevada. Alone. No husband. No mention of him at all. Jasmine looked down, flipped the page. That post has since been deleted, but it was archived. She placed a full-color printout onto the table, facing the committee. Time-stamped, geotagged, February 13th through 15th. The room tensed, not dramatically but measurably. Posture changed, eyes narrowed. You could feel the difference even if no one moved. Next page. October of last year, Jasmine continued. During a radio interview in Concord, New Hampshire, Representative Levitt said, and again I quote, "My husband and I never live apart. That's our promise." Jasmine tapped the page gently, but flight records from January through April show her traveling solo to 5 different states. Not once is her husband listed on the manifest. Not once. She glanced up, this time locking eyes not with Caroline, but with the committee. This isn't hearsay. These are verified federal travel logs filed through official channels. Caroline shifted slightly in her seat. Her hands were clasped now, tight, white-knuckled. Her expression hadn't cracked. Not yet, but the polish was thinning at the edges. Jasmine turned to the final tab in the folder. "Let's talk about employment status," she said, her voice still firm but flat. Representative Levitt has repeatedly stated that her husband left a successful career in finance to join a nonprofit in Dallas. She referenced this move in campaign speeches and committee testimony, often linking it to her belief in family sacrifice for greater causes. Jasmine lifted a thin sheet of paper. The nonprofit she referenced was officially dissolved in 2023, according to IRS filings. Another pause. This one had weight. And that same month, her husband registered a private LLC in Tampa under his own name. The listed business address? Jasmine looked straight ahead now. A condominium unit that just months earlier, Representative Levitt told voters she had never lived in. She lowered the final sheet, then closed the folder. No drama, no gesture. Just a calm, definitive stop, like a judge dropping a gavel in reverse. "I want to be clear," Jasmine said, leaning slightly forward. "Nothing I've shared is private. These are not leaks, not rumors. Every document, every quote, every image was made public by Representative Levitt herself. Her eyes didn't harden, her voice didn't rise, but every syllable landed with precision. This isn't about digging into someone's marriage. It's about reconciling the words we say with the records we leave behind. Because when someone uses their personal life to shape public policy, to sway public trust, and to build a platform of moral authority, then the public has a right to see that story clearly, without edits." She leaned back in her chair, hands off the folder now. The room, moments ago buzzing with anticipation, was dead silent. But silence has a shelf life, and Caroline knew it was running out fast. She sat up straighter, shoulders tight, hands folded too neatly, like she could hold the narrative together with posture alone. "This is a personal attack," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, bouncing off the walls like broken glass. "My marriage is not public property." Her tone cracked slightly on marriage, but she powered through it with forced control, the way politicians do when they sense the ground shifting beneath them. She wasn't just defending her story, she was trying to contain it, box it up before it spread any further. Reporters didn't blink. Cameras zoomed in. Across the room, even her own staff looked like they were bracing for impact. "What we're seeing here is an invasion," Caroline continued, now louder, hands pressing down on the desk as if she could anchor herself physically to the truth she once controlled. A calculated smear campaign dressed up as transparency. But the more she spoke, the more it sounded like a monologue she didn't believe anymore. Her voice no longer filled the room. It ricocheted inside it, colliding with the weight of documents, timestamps, and undeniable facts. "This is about weaponizing my family," she said, staring past the committee, eyes locked on something no one else could see. twisting intimate details into political ammunition. Before Caroline could reclaim control, Jasmine spoke, quietly, clearly, and with the kind of finality that doesn't ask for attention. It commands it. "You made it political," Jasmine said, her voice low but unwavering. No rush, no dramatics. Just 5 words that froze the room more effectively than any raised voice could. Caroline's mouth was still slightly open, caught mid-defense, as if expecting another interruption that never came. Jasmine didn't give her one. "You used your marriage to build a brand," she continued, her gaze not hostile, just unwavering. "To pass legislation, to critique your colleagues, to draw a moral line between you and everyone else." Her hands never left the desk, but her words moved like a scalpel, controlled, precise, cutting through every talking point that had just been used moments before. "So when the facts no longer match the image, that's not personal. That's public record, and the public deserves clarity." She paused, not for effect, but to give the silent space to settle, and it did, like dust after an explosion no one heard coming. Caroline didn't speak. She couldn't, not in that moment. Something had shifted. Her face remained composed, but stiff, too stiff, like someone trying to smile through a crack in the ice beneath them. Across the room, the shift wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. One of her own party members, previously nodding along, now looked down, flipping the first page of the folder, as if he needed to confirm something he already feared was true. Another staffer sitting behind Caroline leaned back slowly in their chair, eyes darting across the committee table like they were re-evaluating the entire game. The kind of energy that once protected her, tight, rehearsed, loyal, was slowly bleeding out of the room. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She let the silence work for her, because it always did. The more Caroline said, the more it unraveled her. The less Jasmine said, the more it landed. The power wasn't in the words, it was in what those words exposed. "This isn't about your private life," Jasmine added, her tone softening only slightly. "It's about consistency, about trust. When someone chooses to turn a personal story into public justification, it becomes subject to public scrutiny. That's not an attack, that's accountability." And still, no one in the room moved. No pens scribbled. No fingers typed. Caroline's supporters weren't defending her anymore. They were studying the table like it might offer an exit, or at least an excuse. But there wasn't one. Because at that moment, Jasmine wasn't speaking as an opponent. She was speaking as a mirror. And what it reflected was beginning to sting. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her expression. Jasmine simply pulled a single sheet from the very back of the red folder, unfolded it carefully, and held it with 2 fingers, like evidence, not performance. "This," she said, "is a screenshot from Representative Levitt's personal blog, dated April 2019. Her voice remained composed but firmer now, laced with something colder, certainty. "The post is no longer live, but it was archived." She turned the paper outward toward the committee, giving everyone a clear view. No one moved. Caroline didn't look at the document, but her body reacted, fingers tightening around her pen, shoulders pulled subtly back, as if bracing for impact. Jasmine placed the page on the table, face up. In this entry, Representative Levitt describes attending marriage counseling. She writes in her own words about being physically and emotionally separated from her husband for 8 months. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Their weight was in their origin, not an accusation, not a leak, but a confession she once made voluntarily. Jasmine paused for exactly the right beat, letting the meaning breathe before continuing. 8 months apart, documented, described, and shared by her. There was no longer tension in the room. There was something heavier. Disbelief, maybe. Discomfort. That kind of sudden stillness that settles over people when they realize the story they've been fed doesn't just have holes. It was built around one. Caroline didn't respond. Her face remained motionless, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the desk, as though staring at a version of herself she no longer recognized. But her silence wasn't strength. It was strategy failing in real time. You could see it unraveling in the way her aides stopped scribbling notes, how one of them placed a hand over their mouth without realizing it, how even her supporters began glancing not at her, but at the sheet of paper Jasmine had just laid bare. Jasmine didn't gloat. There was no victory in her voice, just completion. This post directly contradicts public claims made multiple times by Representative Levitt, she said. Statements that she and her husband had never been apart, that their marriage had remained uninterrupted, that they stood together always without exception. She drew in one quiet breath, her hands returning to a resting position on the table. When those claims are used to build trust with voters, to criticize others for their personal choices, and to shape public legislation, then the truth behind them matters. And that's when the silence finally broke. Not from Jasmine, not from the committee, but from the one person who couldn't afford to lose it. The sound of Caroline's chair scraping back against the polished floor sliced through the stillness like a warning shot. She stood abruptly, movement stiff and ungraceful, all pretense of control gone. "This is character assassination," she snapped, her voice louder than it had been all morning. Too loud, too tight, teetering on the edge of panic. This hearing was never about truth. It's about humiliation. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, not for allies, but for something, anything to stabilize herself. But the room had changed. No one was nodding. No one was coming to her defense. Her voice shook, just barely, but enough for everyone to hear the shift. From composed outrage to desperation. "My family doesn't deserve this. None of this is relevant. It's an ambush," she said, louder this time, as if volume could reverse the damage already done. Her fists were clenched so tightly the tips of her fingers had gone white. The words kept coming, but now they stumbled, collided, overlapped, anger chasing itself in circles. "You're turning my life into a spectacle," she nearly shouted, pointing not at Jasmine, but at the folder, the papers, the proof. But the force of her protest couldn't hide the fear underneath. It was no longer about defending her marriage. It was about defending the version of herself she'd built in the public eye. And it was crumbling. That was when the chairman, still seated, raised one hand, calm, measured, but absolute. "Representative Levitt," he said without flinching, "you will please sit down." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut through her outburst like a scalpel through fabric. Caroline froze mid-sentence, her mouth still open as if a response had been loaded but short-circuited. The room didn't move. It didn't breathe. She stood there for a heartbeat too long, her arms stiff at her sides, the silence now aimed at her. When she finally lowered herself back into her seat, it wasn't defiance. It was defeat wearing dignity like borrowed armor. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze dropped to the desk, empty now, but for a notepad she wasn't writing on, and a pen she was no longer holding. Her shoulders sank just slightly. Her jaw remained locked, but her lips had lost all color. The trademark smile, tight, polished, camera-ready, was gone, not replaced with a frown, but with nothing. Her face was still, too still, like someone staring at a memory she could no longer rewrite. She wasn't reacting. She was absorbing, processing, crumbling, quietly. Around her, aides stopped taking notes. Her supporters looked away. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Caroline Levitt didn't look like the narrative she had spent years crafting. She looked like someone who had finally heard the truth out loud and realized it was louder than she could ever speak over. But hearings don't stay inside hearing rooms. And what Jasmine started with one folder, the press finished with a flood. By the time the committee hearing adjourned, it wasn't the closing remarks people were watching. It was the red folder, the contradictions, the silence that followed. And it was already too late to contain it. Reporters left the hearing room with eyes sharper than when they entered, voices low but urgent into their phones, laptops open before they even reached the sidewalk. What Jasmine Crockett had laid out wasn't just a challenge to Caroline Levitt's character. It was a trailhead, and the media, trained for the hunt, followed it with practiced, surgical intent. They started where the cracks were loudest, Caroline's public timeline. It didn't take long before things stopped lining up. In an interview from 2021, she stated that she and her husband had been married for 10 years, calling him her constant since 2011. But in a 2019 fundraising speech, she described their wedding as just last spring. On a 2018 podcast, she joked about being newly married, referring to the honeymoon phase. Screenshots of her campaign bios over the years showed small, subtle shifts. Years replaced, phrases tightened, milestones rearranged. It was never an outright contradiction, never a glaring lie. But it was like looking at a house where every wall had been moved just an inch off center. You might not see the problem at first, but the longer you looked, the more unstable it felt. That instability got worse when someone checked public records. A scanned copy of a marriage license surfaced, filed in 2019 in Rockingham County. The groom's name matched her husband's. The signature was hers. It was legitimate, dated, and verifiable. But that date stood in direct opposition to at least 4 public statements in which she'd claimed to be married in 2016. The document was real, the math wasn't, and that's when the timeline started to fall apart. The press dug deeper. Tax filings for 2020, publicly accessible through required disclosures, listed her as unmarried. Yet that same year, she gave a televised interview stating, "My husband and I have weathered everything together. He's the reason I believe so strongly in family values." That interview aired just 2 weeks before the date on her tax return. Was it a mistake? A clerical error? Or was it, as some began to whisper, a version of the truth custom-built for different rooms? Then came the social media resurrection, deleted Instagram posts, anniversary photos, captions with years that didn't match. In 2018, 2 years and forever to go. In 2020, celebrating our 4th wedding anniversary today, users dug up images of a bridal shower tagged in early 2019, followed weeks later by a professional wedding shot posted, then quickly deleted with no date attached. It didn't look like sloppiness. It looked like strategy, like someone trying to tell a story with just enough charm to distract from the edits. That's when the former aide spoke up. They didn't go to national news. They went to a small regional paper, quiet, local, and trusted. The quote was short, but it cut like glass. "We rewrote her biography at least 3 times, the aide said, under condition of anonymity. Not because we were hiding something illegal, but because the dates didn't match, and the image mattered." The reporter asked if Caroline had directed the edits. The aide didn't answer, just paused, then said, "We made the truth fit the message." That line hit like a detonation. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't even scandalous in the traditional sense, but it was revealing, because the one thing Caroline Levitt had built her entire platform on, consistency, was now riddled with quiet contradictions. Not the kind that collapse a campaign overnight, the kind that drain its oxygen slowly, subtly, the kind that linger and chip away and make voters ask the worst question of all. Was any of it ever real? Cable networks ran segments with side-by-side timelines. Local affiliates compared speech transcripts with IRS filings and state records. Political analysts tried to stay neutral, but by midweek, even conservative commentators were saying the same thing. She should have just told the truth. It wasn't about the marriage, it was about the math, the precision, the brand. Because Caroline Levitt hadn't just shared her personal life, she'd used it as armor, and now the armor was dented, fractured, and no one could agree on where the cracks started, only that they were spreading. Meanwhile, her team stayed silent. No press conferences, no formal statements, just a slow drip of avoidance. Reporters who had previously been welcomed with open access were now being told, "She's unavailable for comment." Emails went unanswered, phone calls redirected. The campaign website quietly edited language around her personal life, removing dates, trimming descriptors, scrubbing references to never apart. The silence wasn't defensive anymore. It felt strategic, and the public noticed. On social media, the backlash wasn't brutal, it was tired. Comment sections filled with words like, "Why lie?" and "This isn't about marriage, it's about trust." Longtime supporters posted side-by-side screenshots from different years, drawing arrows between conflicting claims. Hashtags like TimelineGate and Truth in the Margins began trending, not because of outrage, but because of exhaustion. Because the public didn't want perfection. They wanted honesty. And Caroline, once seen as the picture of polished morality, now looked like a candidate who had workshopped her life like a speech. And in the background, that quote from the aide kept echoing. We made the truth fit the message. It said everything. It framed every other inconsistency not as accident, but intention. And it forced people to rewatch every clip, reread every caption, not for inspiration, but for evidence. Caroline didn't respond. Not directly. Not at first. Her name trended, but her voice vanished. And in politics, when people start speaking about you more than to you, the momentum shifts. Slowly. Fatally. The narrative isn't yours anymore. The room you once commanded becomes a gallery where others study your image, and then walk away. That's what Caroline was up against now. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, just a question that kept getting louder with every uncovered post, every misaligned date, every silence that followed. What do you believe more, her story or the record? Cornered by silence, boxed in by facts, Caroline did the only thing left in her arsenal. She went back to the cameras, but this time, they didn't blink first. The podium was flanked by two flags, but they didn't feel like symbols of strength, only props. Caroline stepped up to the mic, her team a few paces behind, their faces unreadable. The lighting was harsh, exposing the exhaustion beneath her makeup. She took a breath, then another, and started. I am not a perfect person, she said, her voice cracking slightly on the word perfect, like even her vocal cords had stopped cooperating. But I have always tried to lead with honesty. With heart. She looked down briefly, gripping the edges of the podium, steadying herself like the words might run away if she didn't hold them down. My marriage is real, my family's real, and the love I have for my husband does not deserve to be dissected like a campaign strategy. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it sit there, hoping it would say what words no longer could. The room was quiet but not empathetic. The journalists watching her weren't leaning in. They were recording, observing, analyzing. The silence wasn't out of respect. It was calculation, and Caroline could feel it. She tried again. This has gone beyond accountability, she continued, voice now more defensive than vulnerable. It's become invasive, cruel. I've made mistakes. I'm human. But what's happening now isn't about truth. It's about destruction. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for softness, a nod, even a flicker of understanding. She found none, just steady stares and camera lenses that didn't blink. The performance she'd relied on for years, the calm voice, the firm values, the delicate emotion, wasn't landing. It wasn't connecting, because the people watching weren't angry anymore. They were detached. The trust she had once curated so carefully wasn't just cracked. It was gone. That evening, she took the next step in the damage control playbook. Primetime television, a conservative talk show, friendly territory, soft lighting, scripted questions. She sat on the edge of the leather chair, hands tightly clasped, knees perfectly aligned, eyes glassy but composed. This has been one of the hardest weeks of my life, she began, voice barely above a whisper. Not because of political attacks. I've weathered plenty of those, but because they went after something sacred. She paused, gathering herself, then continued. They took my love, my commitment, and tried to turn it into a political liability. Her tone was soft, almost reverent. The host nodded sympathetically, letting her speak without interruption. But the air between them was thinner than expected. When the host finally spoke, his tone wasn't confrontational, but it was cautious. Caroline, he said gently, do you think any of this might be the result of how your story was told? Not what you feel, but how it's been presented? Her eyes froze for just a second too long. Then she gave a tired smile. I gave people the version of my life that helped them understand me, she said. That's not deception. That's connection. It was meant to sound human, honest, but instead it felt like another rehearsed line, Another carefully shaped answer for a room that was no longer listening. Outside the studio, public response was immediate and cold. The clips were posted, the quotes were shared, but the reactions were quiet, cynical, brief. No outrage, no defense. Just words like, too late, scripted, why now? The warmth she'd once received from her base, the applause, the rallies, the loyalty, had faded into a silence louder than any protest. Because in the court of public opinion, the worst response isn't anger, it's indifference. And now Caroline was standing alone in a story she'd once controlled completely, only to realize it was no longer hers. While Caroline filled the air with explanations, justifications, and broken phrases wrapped in emotion, Jasmine said nothing, and that silence began to echo louder than anything a microphone could carry. Jasmine didn't hold a press conference. She didn't go on television. She didn't write a thread or upload a reaction video. While political pundits speculated and Caroline's team scrambled to salvage control of the narrative, Jasmine quietly returned to her district in Texas. No fanfare, no entourage, just handshakes, town halls, and policy meetings that had been on her calendar before the hearing ever made headlines. She didn't speak about the red folder, the hearing, or Caroline's unraveling. When asked, her response came through a staffer. Representative Crockett is focused on the work her constituents elected her to do. That was it. Clean, simple, closed. And yet her silence didn't read as avoidance. It read as strategy, as strength. She was seen at a local community center in Fort Worth, listening to teachers talk about shrinking school budgets. She visited a small clinic where nurses explained their struggles with staffing shortages. She sat in a veterans town hall, not as a headline maker, but as a listener. Always present, never performative. In every room, people looked at her differently now, not just as a congresswoman, but as a woman who had stood her ground in the most public, high-pressure arena and never once raised her voice. That quiet strength became the story. The media, at first confused by her disappearance from the post-hearing narrative, eventually shifted its tone. Articles began to appear, not about what she said, but what she didn't. Jasmine Crockett redefines political confrontation, read one headline. Silence as a weapon, said another. Cable panels debated her approach. Was it intentional? Was it brilliant? Was it luck? But the people who mattered most, the voters, weren't asking those questions. They had already made up their minds. They weren't reacting to her silence as mystery. They saw it as integrity made visible. In a church basement on the east side of Dallas, during a town hall packed shoulder to shoulder, an elderly man stood slowly and asked for the microphone. His voice was gravelly, his words slow but deliberate. You didn't shout, he said, pointing gently toward Jasmine, who sat calmly near the front. You didn't threaten. You didn't tear her apart. The room hushed. You just laid out what she said, and then you stepped back. A pause. He glanced around the room before continuing. You didn't win that hearing, he said. You just made room for the truth to walk in on its own. There was no applause, not right away, just the heavy silence of truth being named out loud. Then came a wave of nods, quiet murmurs, a few hands pressed to chests. Understanding passed between people in that room like a current. Jasmine didn't respond with a speech. She simply gave a small, respectful nod, folded her hands in her lap, and moved on to the next question. Her restraint became a symbol, not of passivity, but of power. Because while Caroline was trying to patch a sinking ship with televised emotion and softened narratives, Jasmine had done the opposite. She let the record speak. She let the facts breathe. She gave the public space to think instead of trying to tell them what to feel. And in that vacuum of noise, people chose to trust her, not because she insisted on being right, but because she didn't insist at all. Reporters tried to bait her into a comment. Any response to Caroline Levitt's statement last night? They asked outside a library where she'd just met with small business owners. Jasmine didn't stop walking. Her aide replied on her behalf, The Congresswoman believes the public is smart enough to make its own judgment. That answer got more airtime than Caroline's entire interview. Clips from the hearing began circulating again. Not the explosive moments, but the quiet ones. The way Jasmine laid down a document without raising her voice. The way she paused after quoting Caroline's own words. The way she never once looked angry, only certain. On TikTok, Gen Z users called it masterclass composure. On Facebook, older voters shared the clip with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." And in local barbershops, cafes, and front porches, the sentiment spread. She didn't need to raise her voice because the truth did the heavy lifting. Even some of Caroline's former allies began to acknowledge it. One Midwestern congressman, when asked about the fallout, said simply, "Crockett didn't destroy her. She just let the truth show up and stepped out of the way." And perhaps that's why Jasmine's silence hit so hard. Because it wasn't blank, it was full. Full of discipline, full of conviction, full of earned authority. She didn't milk the moment. She didn't weaponize the public's curiosity. She gave the people space, and they rewarded her by filling that space with trust. That trust slowly began to reshape how people saw her. She was no longer just the quiet woman in the navy suit. She was the one who had stood firm when the storm hit, who didn't flinch when the weight of contradiction landed, and who didn't gloat when her opponent cracked under the pressure. She remained still. And in politics, stillness is rarely interpreted as strength. But Jasmine had changed that, not by claiming victory, but by proving she didn't need to. At a youth forum weeks later, a high school senior asked her, "How did you stay so calm when the whole country was watching?" Jasmine smiled faintly, adjusted the mic, and said, "Because I wasn't performing. I was just telling the truth. And the truth doesn't need help. It just needs space." The crowd didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence afterward was its own kind of applause. And that was Jasmine Crockett's win. No celebration, no parade, just trust earned in quiet, one fact at a time. But while Jasmine's silence spoke volumes, Caroline's next move said only one thing. She still believed the story could be saved. Caroline didn't resign. She didn't face censure, ethics hearings, or subpoenas. No formal investigation was launched. No legal consequences followed. On paper, she survived. But in every other way that mattered, she was finished. The support that once came easily, smiling donors, loyal volunteers, polished endorsements, began slipping away, not in protest, but in silence. Phone calls that used to be returned within minutes now took days. Messages that once ended with, "We've got your back," started coming back with, "We need to talk." But no one said it out loud. That was the cruelest part. There was no great reckoning, just a slow withdrawal of belief, one nod, one endorsement, one handshake at a time. In committee sessions, her presence remained, but her influence had evaporated. She would speak, but eyes wandered. Her proposals hit the table with a thud and died there. No debate, no opposition, just nothing. And nothing in politics is the sound of someone losing ground. The people around her, the ones who used to lean in, began to lean away. Former allies excused themselves earlier from meetings. Strategists skipped follow-up calls. Donors who once paid 5 figures for dinner photo ops politely declined invitations. No one attacked. No one defended. They just disappeared. And Carolyn? She kept showing up, still dressed like the woman in the ads, still speaking like the cameras were rolling. But the room had changed, and she hadn't. In a last-ditch attempt to seize back the narrative, Caroline released a video. It was carefully produced, her sitting on a wooden bench, sunlight catching her hair just right, a golden retriever curled at her feet. The background was a quiet park, the kind of American normalcy she'd always tried to embody. She wore a soft blue sweater, no blazer, no podium, no press. "I know things have been hard lately," she said, looking directly into the lens. "But I want to talk to you, not as a politician, but as a person, a wife, a daughter, someone who still believes in service." Her voice cracked slightly, enough to seem human but not broken. "I've made mistakes, and maybe I haven't always told my story in the clearest way, but my heart has never changed." Then she looked off camera, almost wistful. "This isn't about headlines. It's about holding on to what matters, and what matters is trust." It was a well-written script, a well-lit shoot, a well-planned release, and no one believed a word of it. The comment sections filled up within minutes, not with outrage, but with disinterest. Still acting. Too late. Should have said that before you got caught. Others were more brutal. This isn't healing, it's rebranding. We're done here. The post was shared, yes, but not in support. It was passed around like an exhibit, evidence of how far she had drifted from the version of herself people had once rooted for. It wasn't the scandal that ruined her. It was the silence that followed it. Because when things didn't add up, she didn't explain. She just tried to perform again. And no one was buying the script anymore. Back in her district, the signs were even clearer. A local fundraiser that normally sold out within hours struggled to fill half the room. Tables sat empty. Name tags went unclaimed. A key sponsor backed out the morning of the event, citing unforeseen scheduling conflicts. One longtime supporter, who attended only out of loyalty, described the energy in one word: hollow. And Carolyn, dressed impeccably as always, smiled through it. She gave the same speech she'd always given. She thanked the attendees for standing with her. But no one stood at the end. There was no standing ovation, just polite applause. Brief, measured, obligatory. The press, once eager to amplify her message, had moved on. The coverage she received now was clinical. Headlines with her name were paired with words like decline, response fails, and credibility questioned. Journalists no longer scrambled for exclusive quotes from her office. They quoted press statements when they bothered to come and left it at that. Her sound bites stopped trending. Her interviews stopped airing. She hadn't been canceled. She hadn't been condemned. She had simply been tuned out. And perhaps worst of all, she knew it. You could see it in the way she carried herself. Still upright, still composed, but stiffer now. Less spark, less conviction. Her gaze lingered longer on notes, not because she needed reminders, but because they gave her something to look at, besides the people not looking back. In meetings, she took longer pauses, searching for support that no longer came. Her smile, once sharp and intentional, had softened, not from humility, but fatigue. Because when the thing you spent years building begins to slip through your fingers, slowly, publicly, and no one tries to stop it, it's not just a loss, it's a verdict. Caroline had built her political brand on precision, on message, on clarity. But now every word she spoke, every gesture she made, was seen not as leadership, but as strategy. People no longer questioned her facts. They questioned her intentions. And when the public begins to wonder, not if you believe what you're saying, but why you're saying it at all, you've already lost the room. She wasn't disgraced. She wasn't exiled. She was something worse, forgettable. The woman who once walked into hearing rooms with the confidence of a frontrunner now entered like an afterthought. People still shook her hand, still smiled, but the eye contact was shorter, the conversations more guarded. Support, once visible and vocal, had turned into polite distance. Her name was still on signs. Her campaign website was still live. Her office still answered calls. But the momentum, the fire, the conviction, the belief was gone. And when belief leaves a politician, no press release can bring it back. Caroline hadn't been destroyed by scandal. She'd been undone by something quieter, something more final. The slow, public erosion of trust. The kind you don't see coming until it's already behind you. The kind that doesn't roar, it fades. And when it does, all you're left with is the sound of applause that never comes. As Caroline faded from headlines and whispers filled the vacuum she left behind, Jasmine didn't move toward the spotlight. She simply stood where she always had, steady, silent, and unmistakably clear. Jasmine never mentioned Caroline's name again, not in passing, not in interviews, not even when directly asked. The hearing was over. The red folder was closed. And as far as she was concerned, the story had already been told. The rest was up to the public. While social media feeds still swirled with speculation and replays, Jasmine had already turned her attention back to policy meetings and district visits, moving with the same quiet rhythm she always had. There were no victory laps, no press tours. She didn't bask in vindication because she had never sought it. And yet wherever she went, the rooms felt different. The way people looked at her had changed. There was a stillness now when she entered, a pause that wasn't about awe, but recognition. People saw her not as the woman who brought someone down, but the one who never had to. In West Dallas, she stood beneath the flickering lights of a community gym, listening to single mothers talk about after-school programs. In El Paso, she helped secure funding for infrastructure improvements, standing beside construction workers covered in dust and sweat. In Houston, she sat on a panel with educators discussing classroom equity. She didn't mention integrity. She didn't have to. Her presence, her consistency, had become the message. People trusted her not because she said the right thing, but because she didn't say the wrong thing just to be heard. Her silence hadn't been passive. It had been precise. And now that restraint echoed louder than 1,000 headlines. Behind closed doors, other lawmakers took note. Staffers from opposing offices started quietly asking for her team's advice on messaging. Veteran politicians, hardened by decades of noise, began to study her cadence. How she delivered facts without flair, how she let contradiction collapse on its own without pushing it. One senator was overheard saying, "She didn't just change the narrative, she changed the tempo." It was a compliment and a warning, because Jasmine wasn't just gaining support, she was shifting expectations. Even when media outlets tried to bait her, slipping questions about the hearing into unrelated interviews, she refused to bite. On a late-night program, the host leaned in and asked, "Do you think Representative Levitt owes the public more answers?" Jasmine smiled gently and said, "I think the public already heard enough to decide for themselves." Then she pivoted without hesitation into a discussion about veterans' health care and never circled back. It wasn't avoidance, it was discipline, and viewers saw the difference. The trust grew in places she hadn't expected. A conservative radio station in Amarillo, typically hostile to her party, aired a full segment titled, "Crockett, a Lesson in Leadership." The host, known for fiery critiques, said on air, "She didn't gloat, she didn't grandstand, she just kept working." And frankly, that's refreshing. The clip went viral, but Jasmine never commented. Her team didn't even acknowledge it. The strategy was working precisely because it wasn't one. It was who she had always been. At a grocery store in Lubbock, an older woman stopped her near the produce aisle. She didn't ask for a photo. She didn't even say hello. She just touched Jasmine's arm and said, "You made me proud to believe again." Then she turned and walked away. Jasmine didn't chase her down for more. She didn't post it later. She simply smiled, nodded once, and went back to shopping. These were the moments that mattered now. Not applause, not cameras, connection. But it all came to a quiet peak one Thursday night at a college auditorium in Austin. The room was filled with students, educators, and community organizers. The event was billed as a leadership forum, but everyone in attendance knew what they really wanted to hear. Jasmine took the stage with no notes, no teleprompter, just a small bottle of water and her usual calm. She spoke about education, healthcare, housing reform. She answered every question with the same grounded clarity she always had. Then near the end, a young man stood at the mic. Nervous, gripping the sides of the podium, he cleared his throat. "You had every reason to clap back, to tear her apart, but you didn't. Why?" The room tensed, not from discomfort, but anticipation. Jasmine didn't rush her answer. She looked down briefly, then back at the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was softer than usual, but unmistakably firm. "Because I wasn't there to win a fight," she said. "I was there to tell the truth. And sometimes," she paused just long enough, "the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to play by the rules someone else wrote to protect themselves." The room held its breath. You don't have to yell to be right. You don't have to destroy someone to reveal the truth. Sometimes the most powerful move is to let the facts do the talking and walk away. The auditorium didn't explode into cheers. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was respect. And Jasmine, as always, didn't fill it with more words. She let the moment breathe. After the event, students lined up, not for selfies, but to ask about internships, about policy, about purpose. They didn't see her as a rising star. They saw her as something rarer, a leader they could trust, one who didn't bend, didn't break, and didn't build herself by tearing anyone else down. Back in D.C., the ripple effects were still being felt. Quiet conversations in hallways now included her name in lists of the next wave. Invitations to bipartisan panels increased. Think tanks started citing her language in internal memos. But she didn't shift her tone. She didn't raise her profile. She just kept doing the work. She introduced legislation. She returned calls. She showed up. And yet the weight of her presence had changed, not because she shouted to be heard, but because when the shouting stopped, she was still standing. Jasmine Crockett never claimed victory. She never declared her opponent defeated. She never demanded that anyone take her side. But through restraint, truth, and quiet resilience, she had accomplished something that couldn't be spun or erased. She had earned trust. Not given, not traded, earned. And in the end, it wasn't the folder or the facts or the contradictions that defined the moment. It was what she didn't do. She didn't gloat. She didn't retaliate. She didn't compromise. She just stood her ground and let the truth do the rest. And maybe that's why, when someone asked her during a final Q&A what she learned through it all, she simply said, "Sometime, the strongest thing you can do is refuse to play by the rules they set." And then, just like always, she moved on to the next question. Because for Jasmine Crockett, it was never about the moment. It was about what came after. While the political world waited for Jasmine to claim her spotlight, she never even glanced toward the stage. She didn't tweet. She didn't gloat. She didn't linger in victory like so many before her had. Instead, she returned to her schedule like nothing had changed, except everything had. Her phone didn't ring more than usual, but when it did, the tone was different. Sharper, slower, measured. People now paused before speaking to her, not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect she hadn't demanded, respect she hadn't even asked for, but respect that had become undeniable. She wasn't a breakout star. She wasn't trending every day. But in offices across D.C., her name was spoken with a new weight. Staffers whispered her methods like case studies. Don't chase the heat. Crockett didn't. And look what happened. In closed-door briefings, senior members started asking her opinion before giving their own. At first, it startled some of them. The sudden authority, earned not by tenure, but by restraint. They weren't used to stillness being strategic. They weren't used to someone not weaponizing the moment. But Jasmine had made them see it, not by saying it, by living it. What she had done, whether by intention or instinct, redefined the battlefield. She'd walk through a political explosion without raising her voice, and people couldn't stop talking about it, because the real impact wasn't in what she said during the hearing. It was in everything she didn't say afterward. She didn't claim moral high ground. She didn't release official responses to every piece of coverage. She didn't let herself be baited into drama repackaged as follow-up. Her team fielded dozens of requests, national interviews, book offers, panel discussions, speaking engagements, but she declined nearly all of them. The ones she did accept weren't about the hearing at all. They were about housing, school reform, rural health care, topics that didn't trend, topics that built trust, not attention. People noticed, especially the ones who never used to. In a think tank report analyzing modern communication strategies, Jasmine's name appeared not in a footnote, but in the opening paragraph. A case study in earned influence, it read. Her silence was not passive, it was decisive. It left space for public reasoning instead of media noise. And that, in today's political climate, is radical. That quote was shared internally across campaigns on both sides of the aisle, not because it was dramatic, but because it was useful. She became, without trying, a blueprint. The irony was not lost on her staff. Jasmine had never asked to be seen as a symbol. She had never marketed herself as revolutionary. Her success wasn't stylized. It was practiced, grounded, repetitive. She showed up. She told the truth. She didn't embellish. That was the formula, and it worked. What started in the hearing room had rippled outward, subtly like a shift in air pressure before a storm. In community meetings, people sat up straighter when she entered. In interviews, when she did speak, moderators leaned forward, not because she was loud, but because she never wasted words. One late-night political show aired a full 5-minute montage of her not interrupting people. The host called it the most powerful footage we've shown all month. Meanwhile, constituents weren't just following her, they were reflecting her. At a school board meeting in East Texas, a mother stood to speak. Her tone was calm, her points were clear. She didn't shout, she didn't dramatize, but every word landed. Afterwards, someone asked if she was a public speaker. She shook her head and said, "I just watched the hearing. I watched how Congresswoman Crockett held her ground. I figured if she can do that in D.C., I can do it here." It wasn't just admiration, it was permission. Jasmine's silence had done something very few politicians managed to do. It didn't just build credibility, it gave people a model. It showed that facts don't need volume, that you don't have to rise to the bait even when the stakes are personal. That strength isn't always loud, sometimes it's just consistent. And consistency, in a world that spins too fast and shouts too loud, began to feel like truth itself. Her office received more letters that month than it had the entire previous year. Not just requests, but thank yous. From veterans, nurses, retired teachers, even former critics. "You didn't play the game," one handwritten note read, "and that's how I knew you were real." One man enclosed a photo of his late wife, a former civil rights activist. On the back he had written, "She would have believed in you too." Jasmine didn't post about these messages. She didn't read them aloud at events, but she read every single one. And when she walked into town halls and community breakfasts, people looked at her with something more than political support. They looked at her with trust. Trust that wasn't built by slogans or photos or perfect bios, but by the hardest currency in politics: consistency under pressure. There's a reason people started quoting her, not because she said a lot, but because she meant every word. Her one-liners weren't crafted for applause. They were earned through discipline. And perhaps the most quoted of all wasn't even delivered at the hearing. It came weeks later, almost in passing, during a student-led forum. A question about leadership. A pause. And then she said, "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to play by the rules they set." It wasn't followed by thunderous applause, just a stillness, the kind that settles deep and stays there. That quote found its way into classrooms, campaign playbooks, articles, social captions. But Jasmine never repeated it. She didn't have to, because it wasn't about branding. It was about boundary. She had drawn a line without raising her hand, and the world had leaned in to see what it meant. In the months that followed, while other politicians pivoted strategies and reshuffled messages, Jasmine's consistency became her power. She didn't change her tone. She didn't shift her image. She just kept showing up, saying what she meant, and walking out before the cameras could ask for more. And that became her signature. Not just the silence, but what followed it. When a major outlet asked to do a profile piece titled "The Power of Not Reacting," her office declined. The statement was brief. Representative Crockett prefers to let her work speak for itself. And that reply said more than a full article ever could. Even her critics began to adjust. They still disagreed with her policies. But the attacks got quieter, less personal, because the more people saw of her, the harder it became to reduce her to a soundbite. She didn't fit the mold. She didn't play the role. And she didn't react the way they wanted her to. In a world where narrative is everything, she refused to become one. And so, she became something else. A presence. A standard. A silence people leaned into. Not because it was empty, but because it was earned. And long after the headlines faded, after the folders were filed away and the microphones turned off, one thing remained: the echo, not of what Jasmine said, but of what she didn't need to. Caroline Levitt was still in office. She still wore the sharp blazers, still walked into Capitol Hill with her chin held high, still sat at her desk during committee sessions, hands folded, notes prepared. Nothing had visibly changed, and yet everything had. The spotlight that once followed her like a loyal shadow had moved on. Her voice, once amplified across headlines, now echoed back hollow. It wasn't scandal that erased her. It was air slowly leaking from the room, leaving behind the shell of a presence that used to carry weight. She wasn't booed. She wasn't denounced. She wasn't censured or called out in fiery op-eds. There was no public explosion, just a vacuum. And that silence, that absence of resistance, was more damning than outrage, because no one was asking where she stood anymore. They simply stopped asking. Inside the halls of power, the shift was almost imperceptible at first. Conversations she used to lead became ones she was merely invited to. Colleagues who once angled their chairs toward her now faced forward. The inner circle, the one she'd built with charm, calculated loyalty, and moral branding, began quietly drifting away. They didn't fight. They just stopped replying, canceled coffee meetings, rescheduled calls. A longtime donor needed to focus on family. A local paper that once ran her column weekly quietly retired the feature. And through it all, Caroline kept smiling, still precise, still present, still trying to act like nothing was missing, even when she could feel the cold of absence wrap around her like glass. Then came the moment she couldn't hide from. A committee seat, one she had fought for, won, and built policy around, was reassigned. No press release, no formal announcement. Just a revised staff memo, her name gone, her replacement already scheduled for the next panel. She showed up anyway, pretending it was a mistake. It wasn't, and no one corrected her, because there was nothing to correct. It was done, silently, strategically, and permanently. Back in her district, the change was even harder to ignore. At a community town hall, usually packed wall to wall, half the chairs remained empty. Her name still printed on the flyer, her face still framed above the sign-in table. But the energy had vanished. The room clapped politely but no longer lingered after her remarks. Questions became gentler, not out of respect, but disinterest. A young mother asked about school lunch funding, then left before Caroline had even finished responding. A small business owner excused himself early, citing traffic. They didn't mean to insult her, but the indifference cut deeper than any protest ever could. Trying to reset, Caroline released a video. Soft lighting, natural backdrop. A golden retriever curled obediently at her feet. She wore a pastel sweater, her voice gentle, her message rehearsed to seem unrehearsed. "I know it's been a difficult time," she said, looking directly at the camera. "But I'm here, still working, still listening." She spoke about family, service, and faith, pulling from the same themes that had once elevated her. But the comments told a different story. Too polished. Still acting. Nothing real here. The video wasn't dissected. It was dismissed. The problem wasn't the footage. It was the face. People no longer saw themselves in it. They saw a woman performing a version of herself they no longer believed in. Her team urged her to stay visible. Keep posting, stay consistent. People will come back. But the more she showed up, the more people looked away. Not because of what she had done, but because of what she had tried so hard to deny. The story had shifted, and she hadn't. The worst part was that she kept trying. She showed up to hearings prepared, made speeches into microphones that no longer broadcast. She smiled at reporters who walked past her to get to someone else. She stood in rooms where her name once opened doors and now hung awkwardly on unused guest lists. She hadn't fallen. She'd simply been outpaced. The momentum was gone, and momentum, once lost, doesn't come back just because you want it to. One afternoon after a long session, she walked out of the chamber alone. Her aide trailed behind, phone in hand, eyes forward. No press, no cameras, just the sound of her own heels on marble. And that was when it hit her. She wasn't being followed. She was no longer the story. The silence that surrounded her wasn't peace, it was irrelevance. And in politics, that's the final act no one talks about. Not the scandal, not the resignation, but the moment the room forgets you were ever the center of it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.